The nerfs have begun. Season of Discovery nerfs as well as buffs even have started rolling out on the PTR, and as always Wowhead has kind of data mined these things so we can be prepared to be able to pick the best choice of class for ourselves before we move into Season of Discovery as it launches at the end of this month. I wouldn't be too worried if you're freaking out about the nerfs. It's not like they're ridiculous and nerfing classes to the ground, but there is some runes, or were some runes, that were completely overpowered and kind of absolutely busted. So from there, let's break down all of the changes. And even not everything is a nerf, actually, there's quite a few buffs in here as well. First of all, Druid healing runes are getting an actual expansion in their range. So anything in green here is what the change is. So Druid healing with wild growth now actually can reach 40 yards, so it'll be able to heal everything within a 40-yard range instead of a 15-yard range, and the multiplier of the healing is increased from 14 to 34. So the heals of wild growth have been buffed, but Skull Bash, the interrupt that you get as a feral druid, is now sharing a cooldown with feral charge. Now hunters were looking stupid powerful, especially with sniper training giving them 30% extra crit. It was literally a rune that would just have you stand still and just have a ridiculous 30% crit buff. Well, instead that is brought down all the way to 10%. This is still incredibly powerful, but it's just kind of reining it in from being out of this world to now being kind of normal. Also, the chest rune Lone Wolf that was giving you 25% extra damage, just a raw 25% extra damage if you didn't use a pet, has been nerfed to 15% damage. So Lone Wolf and sniper training both nerfed. Hunters are still looking incredibly powerful, and most of the time you weren't even going to be able to use this rune unless it was purely in PvP as a sniper build. But don't worry about that much. Now mages, the change is a little bit nice actually. The rewind time cooldown was like, their healing was basically nerfed very recently, making it a lot harder for them to be more powerful as healers, kind of reining them into like the average healer realm. Well, the 1 minute CD now on rewind time, which is one of their heals, has been reduced in half to 30 seconds. So now you can cast this every 30 seconds, where your current target with the temporal beacon, which is kind of a debuff or a buff you put on your healing targets, gets instantly healed from all of the damage it takes over the last 5 seconds. This is going to be a really nice one to have a change of the shorter cooldown. Paladins were one of the classes that were probably the most overpowered. Quite literally, this was most likely the most OP class, especially Ret Paladins. So let's just roll down what the changes are. Beacon of Light has had its range reduced from 60 yards down to 40 yards. This is a normal change. Basically 60 yards is just kind of ridiculously far. You could be healing someone that's way in another room from you. 40 yards is still really large, so it doesn't really hurt you too much. Now the first way of reining in that Paladin DPS is having Crusader Strike actually kind of reined in a little bit. It was a 4-second cooldown, now up to a 6-second cooldown. This is 50% longer to be able to use Crusader Strike, but having a 4-second CD that hits for 75% of your weapon damage, procs your actual seals, and also restores 2% of your mana was super overpowered. You would never run out of mana as a Retribution or Holy Paladin if you were running this. So this change is, I think, necessary. Having it be made a 6-second CD is something that's actually kind of nice. Now, Divine Sacrifice also was changed. You cannot be used while you're under the effects of Blessing and Protection, Divine Shield, or Divine Protection. Basically, what this means is if you're using Divine Sacrifice, which what it would do is makes all of the rest of the party take less damage, 30% less damage, and you kind of absorb a lot of that damage. What you do in different versions of the game, like Wrath of the Lich King, is you would bubble when you use this so that you actually take 0% damage or cancel aura it. Well, this isn't the case anymore, so Divine Sacrifice is more of a tank CD than it is for like a healer or any of the other off-spec paladins. It's definitely still an extremely useful raid-wide cooldown, but Divine Sacrifice has been reined in a little bit. Now, Seal of Martyrdom, this is the one that has huge huge changes. This is probably the biggest changes I would say out of anything. And this is the other one that I thought was just absolutely too overpowered. And that is that Seal of the Martyrdom gave paladins consistent cleave damage that hit for ridiculous amounts of damage. Well, it used to have your attacks hit up to 3 targets for 30% of your weapon damage every single time. That's every swing you do, an extra 90% of your weapon damage, and it would restore a little bit of your mana. Now it changes to be more of a mana efficient seal. It will hit 1 target now for that 30% damage, and it'll actually chunk yourself a little bit of damage taken of 10% of the damage you inflicted. Now the new change here, and the nice thing though, is it returns mana to your entire raid. It returns mana of 10% of the damage you take from this seal to the whole raid. So within your party for 40 yards, and it should be the whole raid, everyone is returning mana. This is actually really nice as a CD to help people have mana sustain, but it's no longer a ridiculously overpowered AoE DPS ability. And unleashing this seal, or using it with judgment, will now also make you take 10% of the damage it does instead of 2% like it used to. So this is pretty much the biggest one. Don't worry, Ret Paladins, you're still going to be very strong. You're still looking really good. The only thing is now you're just not like in this other stratosphere of overpowered, right? Now, priest players, rejoice. You did receive some buffs. I know priests were looking a little bit sad recently. Priests were going to be one of the weaker classes in the first leveling bracket, but Circle of Healing has been increased in how long the yard is. It heals an entire party, but it was only healing the party within 15 yards. They pretty much all had to be stacked. Now that is 40-yard range, and the healing of this is almost tripled. So the healing of this is significantly stronger. Circle of Healing has been buffed. And one of the main issues with priests for any sort of tank like a warrior or a druid is that if you had a bubble on you, a power word shield, you weren't able to get any sort of rage. Well, this has been changed, and I think this is one of the greatest changes possible in the game right now. In addition to the targets of your power word shield will gain rage from taking damage despite the damage being absorbed. And with Righteous Fury for paladins, it will trigger the damage absorb of during power word shield. So pretty much you will be getting mana back as well if you're a paladin. This is a huge change because priests were kind of looked down upon. You weren't able to use your shields because it didn't allow your tank to actually gain any rage and be able to keep pumping. So priests getting 2 pretty big buffs here. Definitely a major winner in the changes that are happening today. Rogues are also receiving a slight buff, Saber Slash, which is one of the attacks that hits quite hard. It hits for 130% of your weapon damage and puts a bleed up on your target that stacks 3 times. The energy cost of this was reduced from 55 to 45. Now, this is going to be very useful for rogues. Now, you will weave this in and make sure that you keep up this debuff, especially if you're a rogue that's using something like maces or swords. Saber Slash is looking very nice. Now, shamans had a few changes. One of the things that we saw changes that came out today is that shamans and warlocks had their threat modifiers changed. Basically, it reined them in to be like as good of a tank as everyone else, but shamans and warlocks have ridiculous single target threat. They are never going to have to worry about threat so much. So the changes for shamans are that, first of all, their shield mastery rune, which allows you to get mana back whenever you block attacks. If you are a tank shaman, this actually has its mana regeneration doubled from 4% to 8%. This is a massive buff for your actual sustained mana as a shaman, but you also did have a frontal cone of cold that was completely uncapped. Basically, this cone of cold that would hit everything in front of you and do a ton of threat if you are a tank shaman. Now it does have a capped number of enemies, although we don't know what that cap is because from the data mining, that cap just says blast up to 0 enemies. It just means we're gonna have a number that you can hit a certain amount of enemies in front of you. I would wager this is something probably like 4 to 6, maybe. Maybe it's 3, but I think it's gonna be like 4 to 6. But having this be completely uncapped before was like super overpowered. Past that, another buff that shamans get is that their shamanistic rage. This actually returns mana to you. It buffs you. You do more damage, you have more spell power, and then it returns mana to you for the damage you deal. Well, this mana returned to you also is mana that's gonna be returned to your entire party or raid. This is similar to what we're seeing with the paladins. Now, paladins and Shamans both have a version of making yourselves return mana to the entire raid. This is like replenishment in Wrath of the Lich King. This is going to be really useful. We're definitely going to see this be something that is not required, but like something you'll be asking for on long fight situations if you have a Shaman. And like I mentioned before, the threat generation nerf that Shamans received, as well as we'll see in Warlocks in a second, is 50% increased threat gen that they were having from Rockbiter weapon on their Way of the Earth rune. Don't worry, you're getting like 4 times the actual threat generation of normal using Rockbiter weapon. I think it's rained down to 3 times your threat gen. You are going to be just fine. You're never going to have issues with threat generation. They're kind of getting buffed. Realistically, the only actual real nerf you're seeing here is that your frontal cone of cold no longer hits as many targets that are in front of you. That's totally fine. It just brings you back to the realm of reality, and Shamans are looking very, very strong. Shamanistic Rage change is so nice for your raid. Now, the Warlock change is just going to be pretty much the same thing that Shamans did. Their threat generation modifier on their tanking rune Metamorphosis was rained down from 100% increased threat gen to 50%. But it doesn't really matter, again, because you have a AoE cleave, a frontal cleave, you have a taunt, you have an AoE taunt, and you have instant cast Searing Pains, which literally already have a threat modifier on them. So threat is not going to be an issue. If people are worried that they're not going to be able to hold aggro anymore as a Warlock tank or a Shaman tank, that is not at all the case. In fact, this won't really change much of anything for you other than making it so that you actually have to play the game to hold AoE threat instead of pretty much being able to just run in and hold everything and have no issues whatsoever. But that's classic World of Warcraft. Usually classic WoW, you pretty much always have to wait for the tank to get a little bit of threat. Now, don't worry, it's not really going to be that much of the case. It looks like all of the tanks are just really strong already. And last but not least, warriors do have a little bit of a nerf and a little bit of a buff. So tanking warriors now have that their Furious Thunder rune increases the threat generation of Thunderclap by 50%. This will give warrior tanks a little bit of AoE threat gen. This is really nice for warrior tanks. It's something that they were kind of missing. You would usually just try to do as much damage as possible and use cleave to get threat generation. Thunderclap now actually useful instead of just for doing something like slowing the attack speed of the enemies. But they did have a slight nerf in Consumed by Rage. Instead of getting 25% increased bonus damage for 12 seconds, they are getting 20% increased bonus damage for 12 seconds. And this nerf might feel a little excessive right now because warrior DPS didn't really look like they were going to be the strongest DPS class in the game early on, mainly because rage generation is kind of not that amazing just yet, and you don't have Flurry as a warrior DPS, missing out on literally like 30% attack speed. But warriors are the quintessential scaling class in WoW Classic. They will scale to the moon later on, so they needed this to be reined in, and I still think this is kind of crazy. 20% damage as another 20% damage buff. It's like a whole nother death wish already on top of things. I think warriors are looking just absolutely incredible. So today we saw a ton of nerfs and buffs, kind of bringing mainly Paladin and Hunter down to like reality. There's still 2 of the absolute strongest classes right now, especially at the early levels. I still think there's some changes that are gonna happen before we see the versions on live or before we see the launch. Mainly some things like Metamorphosis in PvP is like, nobody will be able to beat a warlock in 1v1s. I mean, like very few people. So I think there's going to be some things that are still reined in, and I was working on my class picking guide to have it out to you guys tomorrow, but now I have to re-record a ton of things for that. So make sure to like and subscribe or follow the channel, whatever it is, so that you can see my class picking guide as it comes out, and I break down what's good and what's bad and what are going to be kind of the expectations of every single class, so you know what to pick for yourself. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will try to keep you updated on everything Season of Mastery when I'm back from the Thanksgiving break.